House. My name is Dr. Mehmet Çiftçi. I'm in charge of the library and the archive here, and I also help to organize our program of lectures and conferences. Welcome to the second lecture in our Recollection lecture series. The purpose of this series is about recovering and remembering key thinkers and themes from the Christian tradition. Last week we had a lecture by Professor Andrew Lau. Next week we're going to have a lecture by Father George Westhaver on Dr. Pusey and the Pre-Raphaelites. And we have conferences coming up this term on the meaning of money and on the Council of Nicaea. We have a lot more going on this term, and it's all in this term card. So please take one of these away with you as you leave. And if you would like to know by email what we have happening this term, there is a clipboard going around where you can write down your name and email. Parker at the back is going to be handing it around, so please do write down your contact details if you would like to hear from us. So it's just my great pleasure now to introduce our speaker. Beatrice Scudeler studied English at Durham University before coming up to Oxford to do her MSc in 18th century English literature. She now works as a journalist, writer, and editor, and you can find her work in The Spectator, in The Critic magazine, Public Discourse, The Dispatch, The European Conservative, The Plough, and in many other publications. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here in the Pusey House chapel, in such a beautiful chapel, to talk to you about probably my favorite topic that I could be talking about, which is Jane Austen. So a couple of months after finishing my undergraduate degree, I presented my dissertation at my first ever conference. I was the youngest there, and I was absolutely terrified. I was also a new convert to Christianity myself. My paper revolved around A.C. Bradley's idea that Jane Austen was both a satirist and a moralist. Everyone was kind enough about it, but it didn't go down too well. We all went to the pub after the first day of the conference, and a much more experienced academic than myself prodded me on what I meant. Austen was a moralist, sure, but what made her a distinctly Christian moralist, he asked. I would like to say that I answered brilliantly, but I did not. Instead, I blurted out something nearly unintelligible about how Austen's Christian faith made her wary of what I called the pride of the satirist. And then I spilled some wine on myself. I clearly did not have a fully formed answer back then, but the question is one that has haunted me ever since. Was Jane Austen's faith sincere or merely a matter of social conformity? And even if she was genuinely devout, does that devotion translate to her novels? In other words, did Austen write Christian novels, or novels that simply happened to be written by a Christian? The question of Austen's religious practice is the easier one to address. The short answer is that yes, she was a practicing member of the Church of England throughout her life. Her father, George, and two of her brothers, James and Harry, were clergymen. She would have attended church at least once, if not twice, every Sunday. In fact, church attendance was so important to her that in the final novel she completed before her death, Persuasion, the heroine Anne Elliot becomes suspicious of her cousin's moral standing when she discovers that he has a habit of spending Sundays traveling instead of going to church. Similarly, in Mansfield Park, the hero Edmund Bertram is shocked to discover that Mary Crawford, the woman he is in love with, prefers private devotions to going to church, so he has to remind her of the duty of church attendance. As well as this, Austen took receiving communion very seriously. A copy of a book called A Companion to the Altar by William Vickers, signed 1794 and now residing at Princeton University Library, is one of only 20 books that we know with certainty to have been in Austen's personal collection. Biographer Irene Collins suggests that Austen would have made regular use of Vickers' book, a guide for Anglicans to prepare themselves spiritually to receive Holy Communion. Vickers emphasizes self-examination and repentance, which will become relevant to my discussion of Austen's novels in the second half of this lecture. Austen even wrote to her sister Cassandra in 1808 to express her shock that an acquaintance of theirs, Mrs. Powlett, had gone up to receive communion despite having committed the sin of adultery. Receiving communion was a serious business for Austen. We also know that Austen's father placed particular importance on both communal and individual prayer. When Austen's brother Frank left home as a young Navy officer, George Austen wrote to him to remind him that praying in the morning and at night was a duty which nothing can excuse the omission of. And while Austen doesn't mention praying particularly often in her surviving letters, she did write prayers of her own, 3 of which survive, and which I will tell you a little bit more about in a while. The longer answer is that Austen's Christianity was shaped not only by the family in which she was born and raised, but also by the social and religious changes of her time. On the one hand, she was absolutely a lifelong Anglican and very much her father's daughter. Like her father, she didn't have either a puritanical or a Calvinist strain in her. She didn't emphasize human corruption and wickedness, but rather, as Roger E. Moore argues, she believed in the possibility of moral improvement. She was also somewhat wary of the evangelical movement, which, partly thanks to the influence of the famous abolitionist William Wilberforce, was rapidly gaining influence in England. She seems to have had a distaste for the kind of overly emotional language which was often used by evangelicals. For example, she particularly disliked the sermons of her cousin Edward Cooper. As well as this, as Irene Collins tells us, evangelicals stressed the total depravity of human nature and the need to be born again through the gift of the Holy Spirit. This was a view Jane Austen could not possibly accept. The undesirable characters in her novels are not so much born wicked as led astray. End of quote. I think Collins has a point here. Take Mansfield Park, for example. The Bertram sisters are shown to be unprincipled and misguided, but this is more because their father has not tended to their education than because of any inherent flaws. And although Austen's characters do have conversions of heart, in fact, all of her major heroines and heroes do, they tend to be the cumulative result of deep reflection, not sudden, powerful conversions of the kind that we associate with the concept of being born again. In the same novel, Mansfield Park, the rakish Henry Crawford appears to abruptly reform himself out of a wish to win the heart of the heroine, Fanny Price, but as readers we are not meant to trust this. Not long after, in fact, he ends up committing adultery with the married Maria Bertram. And yet, evangelicalism did have an influence on Austen in later life. She read and praised the evangelical writers Thomas Gisborne and Thomas Clarkson, and we know this from her letters. And when her niece Fanny Wright wrote to her in 1814 to ask her advice on whether she should consider an evangelical young man as a suitor, Austen replied, "I am by no means convinced that we ought not all to be evangelicals, and am at least persuaded that they who are so from reason and feeling must be happiest and safest." Now, understanding the Anglicanism in which Austen was brought up, as well as the evangelicalism to which she was exposed later in life, give us the context in which to understand the prayers that have survived. And in turn, those prayers are, I believe, a much neglected key to understanding Austen's novels themselves. The language used in the prayers suggests that they were probably intended for communal use. After Austen's father died, she may have used them to lead the remaining household through evening prayer. The prayers are deeply steeped in the language of the Book of Common Prayer, to which Austen, according to Irene Collins, was wholly devoted. Other scholars agree. Bruce Stovall notes that the prayers employ the diction and rhythms of the BCP, and Margaret Ann Doody even argues that the Book of Common Prayer, that its influence on Austen extended to her novels, remarking that it is here, I believe, that we must look for the origins of Austen's balanced and coordinated sentences. The BCP was and still is, of course, central to the practice of the Anglican faith. And yet in Austen's prayers, as much as they are shaped by the Book of Common Prayer, a little bit of evangelical influence starts to seep through. Let's look at two very telling passages from the first of her prayers, and these should be on your handout. Look with mercy on the sins we have this day committed, and in mercy make us feel them deeply, that our repentance may be sincere and our resolution steadfast of endeavoring against the commission of such in the future. Teach us to understand the sinfulness of our own hearts and bring to our knowledge every fault of temper and every evil habit in which we have indulged to the discomfort of our fellow creatures and the danger of our own souls. On the one hand, this prayer is distinctly Anglican in the Book of Common Prayer tradition, with its focus on correcting evil habits by reinforcing instead the habit of prayer. On the other hand, the emphasis on feeling repentant and on self-examination reveals something slightly different. While a little hesitant, Irene Collins does grant that the prayers reveal a consciousness of the need for soul-searching, which has sometimes been attributed to evangelical influence. Bruce Stubble goes further, suggesting that Austen's petition for self-knowledge is much more explicit than the prayers in the Book of Common Prayer. This focus on self-knowledge could have been partly informed, of course, by the book by William Vickers that I mentioned earlier on. But paired with the attention given to the virtue of repentance, it does suggest that towards the end of her life, Austen's faith may well have taken on a more evangelical tinge. So we have a clear sense of the importance both of daily habit and of self-examination followed by repentance. If we also look at the third prayer, we get an even fuller picture of the practices and virtues on Austen's mind. She asks God the following, and this should be on your handout as well. Incline us, O God, to think humbly of ourselves, to be severe only in the examination of our own conduct, to consider our fellow creatures with kindness, and to judge all they say and do with that charity which we would desire from them ourselves. Again, we find self-knowledge here, but we also find humility and charity, two distinctly Christian virtues. With all of this information at hand, we can now finally turn from Austen, the clergyman's daughter, to Jane Austen, the novelist. In literary studies in the last century, Austen has not always been seen as a distinctly Christian novelist. No one really questions her own private devotion, the evidence is plenty, but many simply view her work as separate from it. This is the argument that the eminent and otherwise brilliant Austen scholar Claudia Johnson makes in a book called 30 Great Myths about Jane Austen. In the chapter titled Myth 18, Jane Austen was a Christian moralist, Johnson concludes that despite Austen's own personal Christian faith, she's ultimately uninterested in passing moral judgments in her art. The late philosopher Gilbert Ryle, in his absolutely fascinating essay, Jane Austen and the Moralists, makes almost the opposite argument, but sort of comes around to the same conclusion. He argues that Austen was genuinely interested in moral questions, specifically that she was influenced by Aristotelian virtue ethics, but that her ethics was secular as opposed to religious. He goes on to say, and this quotation is on your handout, I am sure that Austen was personally not merely the dutiful daughter of a clergyman, but was genuinely pious. Yet hardly a whisper of piety enters even into the most serious and most anguished meditations of her heroines. They never pray, and they never give thanks on their knees. 3 of her heroes go into the church. Routine church going on Sunday with the rest of the family gets a passing mention 3 or 4 times, and Fanny Price in Mansfield Park is once stated to be religious. But that is all. I am not suggesting that Jane Austen's girls are atheists, agnostics, or deists. I am only saying that when Jane Austen writes about them, she draws the curtain behind their Sunday thoughts, whatever they were, and her creative imagination. Her heroines face their moral difficulties and solve their moral problems without recourse to religious faith or theological doctrines. End of quote. Ryle does have a point, and so does Johnson. Austen's heroines don't suddenly break into effusions of piety or get on their knees to pray every other page. They don't constantly go to a clergyman for advice. In fact, we do know that Austen could be very scathing about the clergy when she wanted to be in her novels. Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice and Mr. Elton in Emma are just examples of clergymen being pompous and greedy. As Roger E. Moore points out, Austen's anti-clerical humour is often aimed at correcting practices in the Anglican Church, such as non-residence and pluralism, which could be abused to accrue wealth while leaving the daily duties of the parish to a poorly paid curate. But ultimately, Moore also tells us that unlike some evangelicals, Austen does not advocate change or criticize the Church's practice or its traditional relationship to the state. She is not at all blind to the failures of the Church of England, but she remains closely aligned with it. So what is happening here? I think what is happening is that Johnson and Ryle, as brilliant as they are as scholars, because they are yet blinded by their own post-Victorian sensibilities. Sarah Emsley, in her 2005 book, Jane Austen and the Philosophy of the Virtues, makes the point that some of Austen's reticence about religion in her writing can be attributed to a customary Church of England reserve about spirituality. She continues, and I quote, "It is because Christian faith is fundamental to her outlook that it does not need to be debated in her novels. Novelists later in the 19th century were increasingly explicit about religion and faith because for the Victorians, it no longer seemed possible to rely on the common language of the Christian tradition." End of quote. As well as this, I've already mentioned that the increasing popularity of the evangelical movement in the late 18th and 19th centuries paved the way for a much more emotionally expressive form of religion in the Victorian era. While Austen, as we have seen, was to an extent influenced by evangelical sentiment, her prose style and narrative structure retained a considerable level of emotional restraint. By the Victorian era, her artistic preferences were actually out of favour. It's no surprise, perhaps, then, that in the latter part of the 19th century, Austen was somewhat neglected. She may be the most read English novelist now, but after her death, much more explicitly pious and sentimental writers like Hannah More and Charles Dickens vastly outsold her. I believe we have inherited these expectations of what the affirmation of the Christian faith should look like from the Victorians, and that we are wrongly reading Austen's novels through those expectations. By contrast, early reviewers of Austen had no difficulty recognizing that although she was restrained in her expression of faith, yet she was not a writer who happened to be a Christian, but a writer whose faith was a fundamental part of her artistic identity. In 1821, only 4 years after her death, Richard Whately noted in a review of her novels that Miss Austen has the merit, in our judgment most essential, of being evidently a Christian writer, a merit which is much enhanced, both on the score of good taste and of practical utility, by her religion being not at all obtrusive." End of quote. If we entertain the possibility that Whately was right, that Austen is both unobtrusively and yet evidently a Christian writer, where shall we look for the clues? I suggest that we take all the information that we've laid out so far, from Austen's own prayers to the various sources of influence that we've covered, like George Austen's brand of Anglicanism and focus on prayer, the Book of Common Prayer, William Vickers's book, A Companion to the Altar, and the emerging evangelical movement, and that we test out if we can find these concerns in her novels. We're not necessarily looking for scenes where Austen's narrative voice is exclaiming, "I'm writing about a very pious heroine," although there are actually a few instances of that. But rather, we are looking for evidence that Austen is imbuing her characters with virtues and thought processes that only make sense in the specific Christian context of Austen's own faith practices. Here, it would be remiss of me not to bring in Alistair MacIntyre. MacIntyre, a philosopher who sadly passed away just earlier this year, in a brilliant work called After Virtue from 1981, argued that Jane Austen's interest in morality was influenced both by Aristotle's virtue ethics and by her Christian faith. MacIntyre wasn't actually the first philosopher to suggest that Austen had either directly or indirectly been influenced by Aristotle. Gilbert Ryle, whom I've already mentioned, had made the very same point in the 1960s, over a decade earlier. Ryle argues that in the 18th century, there were two main camps of moralists: the Calvinists, who paint characters as either wholly bad or wholly good, damned or saved, and the Aristotelians, who instead see people, in Ryle's words, as differing from one another in degree but not in kind. And Ryle puts Austen firmly in the Aristotelian camp. For Aristotle, your character is not fixed, but you can instead improve in certain qualities through developing the right habits or virtues. Now, remember when I said we should keep Austen's prayers at the back of our minds? Well, we have already seen that habit is really important to Austen, so I think Ryle is right in pointing out that she thinks in an Aristotelian way. But Ryle wrongly concludes that if Austen's ethic is Aristotelian, then it can't also be Christian. And here is where MacIntyre becomes key, because he corrects precisely this error. MacIntyre concludes that it is her uniting of Christian and Aristotelian themes that makes Jane Austen the last great, effective, imaginative voice in the tradition of thought about and practice of the virtues. She's Aristotelian in her focus on achieving virtue through habituation. But the specific virtues which are important to Austen are Christian virtues, not the virtues of the Greek philosophers. Remember when I mentioned that Austen's prayers emphasize not only habit, but also humility, self-examination, repentance? Well, that is precisely what makes MacIntyre think of Austen as distinctly Christian. First of all, there is the virtue of humility. Humility is not a key virtue for the pagan philosophers, but it is central to Austen. In the first prayer, she asks God, "Save us from deceiving ourselves by pride or vanity." And we've already seen that in the third prayer, she petitions God to help us think humbly of ourselves. Irene Collins remarks that Austen's prayers make it obvious that, quote, "she was clearly aware of the dangers inherent in her own shrewd assessment of the people around her and prayed earnestly for help in avoiding malice." But do we see this humility, this interest in this kind of humility in Austen's novels? I think the answer is absolutely yes. Pride is probably the vice that is most frequently criticized in Austen's works. We have, of course, Pride and Prejudice, in which both of the main characters, Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, are guilty of being prideful and must learn humility before eventually marrying at the end of the novel. But we can also think, for example, of Emma and its titular heroine, Emma Woodhouse, who prides herself on being such a good judge of character that she feels entitled to meddle in the lives of absolutely everyone she knows, to all kinds of very negative effects. Then there is Austen's focus on self-knowledge. We saw in the prayers that Austen is very interested in self-examination, and so are her characters. MacIntyre argues that Austen assigns a central place to self-knowledge, And specifically, he says that this is a Christian rather than a Socratic self-knowledge, which can only be achieved through a kind of repentance. It's not just about gaining in wisdom, in other words, but about feeling keenly the weight of what one has done to harm others, having a conversion of heart, and changing one's actions as a result. C.S. Lewis agrees with MacIntyre that repentance, which he refers to as undeception, is crucial in 4 out of Austen's major novels: Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Emma. All 4 heroines in those novels, Lewis argues, discover that they have been making mistakes both about themselves and about the world in which they live. All their data have to be reinterpreted. All realize that the cause of deception lay within. This is such an important point that I want to spend some time looking at 2 out of those 4 examples of undeception, as Lewis terms it. Sense and Sensibility is perhaps the most explicitly Christian one. Marianne Dashwood, one of the 2 heroines of the story, is confessing to her sister Eleanor that she regrets her past behavior. After being abandoned by her suitor, Mr. Willoughby, Marianne lets herself descend into depression, eventually ignoring the needs and concerns of all those who love her, and almost dying from going on a long walk during a storm. I know this sounds a little ridiculous, but people really did die of bad weather back then, and in fact, for Jane Austen, rain was one of a very short list of good reasons not to attend church on a Sunday. Had I died, Marianne tells Eleanor, it would have been self-destruction, by which she means suicide. I wonder that the very eagerness of my desire to live, to have time for atonement to my God and to you all, did not kill me at once. Marianne seeks atonement. She wants to right her wrongs. And the use of the possessive when she says my God rather than simply God could hint, as we've already seen, that a little of that evangelical focus on a personal relationship with God is creeping through. Then we have Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. She has just received a letter from Mr. Darcy explaining why he decided to separate his friend Mr. Bingley from her sister Jane, and revealing that Mr. Wickham, who seemed respectable to Elizabeth, had in fact attempted to elope with Mr. Darcy's 15-year-old sister Georgiana for her dowry. Elizabeth is in shock that she has misjudged both Mr. Wickham and Mr. Darcy so severely because, like Emma, she thought she was a good judge of character. She grew absolutely ashamed of herself, the narrator tells us. Then we hear Elizabeth's internal dialogue. I, who have prided myself on my discernment, how humiliating this discovery, yet how just a humiliation. Till this moment, I never knew myself. Once again, we see 2 key virtues here, self-knowledge and humility. Elizabeth believes that this is the first moment she actually knows herself. And when she says, how humiliating this discovery, of course, she doesn't simply mean that she is embarrassed, although she is that as well, but rather that she has been humbled. What's interesting is that although neither MacIntyre nor Lewis really discusses this, Elizabeth's moment of repentance and humility is mirrored by Mr. Darcy's own admission of his pride at the end of the novel. After Elizabeth accepts his second marriage proposal, he admits to her that he was wrong to make Mr. Bingley think that Jane was not truly in love with him. He also admits that he should not have dismissed Elizabeth and her family as inferior to him. He confesses to her, by you I was properly humbled. He learns the pitfalls of pride as much as Elizabeth does. Humility and self-knowledge, however, are not the only virtue that Austen cares about. MacIntyre suggests that constancy is particularly important in both Mansfield Park and in Persuasion, especially as it is reinforced by and reinforces the Christian virtue of patience. In Mansfield Park, Fanny Price patiently suffers because the man she loves is in turn in love with the glamorous but amoral Mary Crawford. And similarly, in Persuasion, Anne Elliot remains constant to Captain Wentworth even for the 8 long years that they are apart. For the Austen scholar Sarah Emsley, Austen prizes instead the importance of the virtue of faith as well as contemplation, a virtue inherited from Aristotle, but which assumes particular significance in Christianity. The highest virtue is contemplative, argues Emsley. And then she cites a lyrical passage in Mansfield Park in which the heroine Fanny Price is speaking to Mary Crawford and praising the beauty of the evergreen trees on the estate grounds at Mansfield Park where she lives. And this quotation is on your handout as well. When one thinks of it, Fanny says, how astonishing a variety of nature. In some countries, we know the tree that sheds its leaf is the variety, but that does not make it less amazing that the same soil and the same sun should nurture plants differing in the first rule and law of their existence. You will think me rhapsodying, but when I am out of doors, especially when I am sitting out of doors, I am very apt to get into this sort of wandering strain. One cannot fix one's eyes on the commonest natural production without finding food for a rambling fancy. This passage might be interpreted simply as an appreciation of the natural world, a capital R appreciation of nature, but I think Emsley is correct in assuming that Fanny is more specifically contemplating nature as God's creation. Fanny is elsewhere described as praying fervently, is said to be religious, and shows regret when Mr. Rushworth reveals that the chapel at his estate of Southerton is no longer used for family prayers. All the context is in favor of Emsley's interpretation of contemplation being a very important virtue to Austen. And yet, I can't help but think that in Austen's novels, the most crucial virtue is the Christian virtue of hope. As I shall explain shortly, I think the centrality of hope accounts for both the moral growth of Austen's heroes and heroines and determines the genre which Austen chooses to write in, the genre of comedy. Hope is structurally essential in Austen's novels, and I mean that at the very level of the plot. The premise of all of Austen's major works is that a good marriage is being prevented from taking place because either the heroine or the hero, or both, must cultivate their character and overcome their vices before they can get married. This means that in each novel, there is a stalemate period in which one of the main characters can do nothing but to hope against hope that the conflict will be resolved. To give a few examples, in Sense and Sensibility, Eleanor Dashwood is in love with Edward Ferrars, who is secretly engaged to be married to someone else, and for a large portion of the novel, she patiently waits in hope of a happy resolution, not knowing if Edward will ever be free of his prior engagement. In Pride and Prejudice, both Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, at different stages of the story, hope the other is still in love with them while having no guarantee of it. In Mansfield Park, Fanny Price spends a long time hoping that Edmund Bertram will come to love her, despite his infatuation with Mary Crawford, and the list goes on. Yet no novel is so clear in its representation of hope as Persuasion. Its heroine, Anne Elliot, is still in love with Captain Wentworth over 8 years after having been persuaded to break off her engagement to him. And though she does not know this at first, he still requites her love. The entire plot of the novel relies on the enduring hope of the two main characters that Providence will reunite them if that is indeed God's will for them. In fact, the word Providence is used 3 times in Persuasion, which we should note is not even a particularly long novel to begin with, so the use of that word 3 times seems quite significant. In one instance, the narrator laments the fact that Anne's father, Sir Walter Elliot, lacked the principle or sense to maintain the family in the station of life, meaning rank and wealth, in which Providence had placed him. This gives us a clue to Austen's understanding of the term providence. Trusting in providence doesn't mean acting recklessly and simply expecting God to pull one out of a terrible situation regardless. Rather, it's about doing what is humanly possible, but leaving the rest to God's wisdom. The other two instances in which the word is invoked have to do with Anne and Captain Wentworth retaining hope in their potential future reunion. We see from Anne's internal thought process that now, age 27, which for Austen is a terribly old age, I'm 28, so I'm basically decrepit by Austen standards, that she would not now at 27 be as cautious as she had been when she was 19 in rejecting Wentworth, as this over-anxious caution, as she terms it, seems to her to insult exertion and distrust providence. Once again, notice here that exertion, meaning effort and virtuous behavior, does not go against providence, but rather works with it. The final instance of the use of the word providence is halfway through the novel, where all the main characters go to Lyme Regis, and Anne and her sister narrowly miss meeting their long-estranged cousin, Mr. Elliot. Captain Wentworth not so subtly remarks to Anne that it must be the arrangement of providence that she did not meet Mr. Elliot. Now, Mr. Elliot would have been considered a natural potential suitor for Anne, as their union would have meant keeping the Elliot estate, Kellynch Hall, within the family. So Captain Wentworth's words signal to Anne that it may be providential for her to remain single, implying that perhaps he's still interested in her. Of course, the more cynical among us could claim that Captain Wentworth is merely using a turn of phrase and does not realize the theological weight of his own statement. But I think this doesn't really square with the choice of diction in the rest of the novel. In his letter to Anne at the end of the story, in which he asks for the second time for her hand in marriage, he characterizes his emotional state to her by saying, "I am half agony, half hope." Note that he does not say half in agony or in hope. He wholly inhabits those two states at the same time. Those two states are fighting each other within him in this internal conflict. You have hope on the one hand, a Christian virtue, and agony, which we can take to mean despair, on the other hand, despair, of course, being the vice that opposes hope. Yet by writing to her, in spite of the temptation to despair, Captain Wentworth is actively practicing the virtue of hope. He is choosing to make a habit of it by asking her to marry him again instead of giving up. What is more, Captain Wentworth is a foil to Anne's cousin, Mr. Elliot, who, if you remember from earlier in this lecture, is said to travel on Sundays, which is entirely unacceptable, both for Austen and for her heroine, Anne Elliot, which means he's likely not attending church so that he can travel. On the other hand, Captain Wentworth is shown as having religious sentiment, and this is even apart from his hopes of reuniting with Anne. When Anne's relative, Louisa Musgrove, injures herself during a seaside trip to Lyme Regis, Anne observes Wentworth as he sat near a table, leaning over it with folded arms and face concealed, as if overpowered by the various feelings of his soul, and trying by prayer and reflection to calm them. So much so for Austen's heroines never being depicted praying. Here we have, perhaps not a heroine, but a hero, being depicted doing exactly that, praying ardently for someone's recovery. There are far more examples of the virtue of hope in Austen's novels that I do not have the time to go through today, unfortunately. So I want to conclude my lecture today by looking at how hope as a virtue interacts with the genre in which Austen chose to write, comedy. The genre of comedy allows Austen to tie together all of her main concerns, not just the representation of hope, but also the issue of self-knowledge and the practice of humility. Now, by comedy, I don't just mean a novel that is funny, although Austen's novels are absolutely that as well, but rather a novel that structurally begins with chaos and ends in order. In Austen's case, specifically the kind of social order and harmony brought about by the marriage of two virtuous individuals. Austen was very good at noticing patterns of vice, and she created absolutely unbearable characters. If any of you here are fans of Mansfield Park, you will recoil if I mentioned the name of Mrs. Norris, who's probably the most awful Austen character in all of her novels. But she never condemns even her greatest villains to complete ruin. The wicked are punished, justly, sure, but never so severely that they cannot recover, or that we cannot imagine their souls eventually being saved and their character one day improving. The rakish Mr. Willoughby in Sense and Sensibility gets somewhat of a redemption arc, as at the end of the novel he explains to Eleanor Dashwood that he fully feels the guilt of having abandoned her sister Marianne. In Mansfield Park, the adulterous Maria Bertram and the greedy, overbearing Mrs. Norris end up living together away from the family estate to hide Maria's shame after she commits adultery and after her divorce. The narrator tells us that they provide mutual punishment for each other, yet they are not alone, and they are not entirely isolated from society, as many other women might have been in Austen's time after committing adultery and getting a divorce. In Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Wickham, at the end of the novel, is never again received at Pemberley, and yet Mr. Darcy still helps him from afar with his career for the sake of his sister-in-law Lydia. Austen doesn't rejoice, as a straightforward satirist would do, in seeing the bad be brought to utter misery. As A.C. Bradley argues, she is never cynical and not often merely satirical. A cynic or a mere satirist may be intellectually pleased by human absurdities, but Austen is not. And we saw in the prayers that Austen was particularly cautious of judging others uncharitably, in fact. So when I said, as a very inexperienced 21-year-old, that Austen's morality is distinctly Christian because she is wary of the pride of the satirist, perhaps I had a point after all. She only punishes the wicked to the extent that they deserve it, but no more than that. Her villains do not meet a tragic end, and hence, C.S. Lewis wrote that though the world of Austen's novels had the serious, unyielding core, it is not a tragic world. But it's MacIntyre, once again, who elaborates this idea most clearly. He wrote, and I quote, "Jane Austen's moral point of view and the narrative form of her novels coincide. The form of her novels is that of ironic comedy. Jane Austen writes comedy rather than tragedy for the same reason that Dante did. She is a Christian, and she sees the telos of human life implicit in its everyday form." Interestingly, Bruce Double also draws this comparison to Dante, arguing that in Austen's prayers, as in Christianity as a whole, life is a divine comedy. It is good, just, harmonious, and all will turn out well in the end. Once again, let me be clear, this doesn't mean that everyone ends up happy. But it does mean that none of Austen's characters are unjustly punished, and that social order is re-established by the end of each of her novels through a good marriage. Austen remains aware of human foibles throughout, but she is able to temper her judgment through the virtue of charity. Similarly, many of her characters, for example, Mr. Darcy, remain aware of human imperfections. For example, how ridiculous in Pride and Prejudice Elizabeth's family can be, but they learn to treat others more charitably. Now, I want to conclude today with a reflection on Christianity and the genre of comedy by theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. In an essay on humor and faith, Niebuhr suggests that laughter is the beginning of prayer, because both laughter and prayer allow us to see the incongruities of our existence while still retaining hope in God's plan for salvation. But, Niebuhr adds, if laughter seeks to deal with the ultimate issues of life, it turns into bitter humor, and it becomes an expression of our own sense of the meaninglessness of life. That is precisely what a cynical satirist would do. Think, for example, if you've read them, of Evelyn Waugh's early satires. They are bitter. That's what a cynic does. He looks at humanity, judges it to be irreparably ridiculous, and laughs bitterly. And that is precisely what Austen did not do. She refused to see her characters in black and white. She refused to preclude the possibility of moral improvement, to lose hope that they might change. And in doing so, I argued that she presented an anthropology that is both distinctly Christian and distinctly comedic. Austen was very good at pointing out the incongruities of life, precisely because she had faith that when we are reunited with God, there will be no incongruities left. She could laugh at the folly of human behavior, precisely because she had hope. Hope in a providence that so often does what we least expect. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Beatrice. We have some time now to ask our speaker some questions, and I would like to use my right to ask the first one. You mentioned Mr. Collins, perhaps the most ridiculous of all of her clerical characters, you know, and it would be very easy to think, you know, when you read about that character that she's very critical of the church. But I was wondering, are there any positive depictions of the clergy in her novels to sort of balance the depictions of people like Mr. Collins?
That's an excellent question. So I would say, first of all, by the standards of Austen's own time, Mr. Collins is not necessarily a terrible clergyman. What I mean by that is, at the time that Jane Austen was writing, becoming a clergyman was simply one of the viable career options for anyone who was well educated. So it was not necessarily a matter of very deep devotion, though I'm sure many clergymen did have that as well, but rather, especially if a young man was a younger son of a wealthy or middle-class family, it could be a viable career. It was not as high status as obviously being a landowner or being in the Navy or the Army or even having a career in politics or in law, but it was still a respectable profession. So many young men went into the church for that reason. And there was not so much in her time an expectation of being a clergyman in the Church of England being a vocation in the sense that we would understand today. It was more, there are certain duties that you need to fulfill, and if you fulfill those, then that's all good. And that's what Mr. Collins does. You know, he seems like a fairly devout young man, even though he is ridiculous and uncharitable in many ways. He has many flaws, but he does seem to be genuinely a Christian, and he is even said to write his own sermons, which many clergymen did not do. Many clergymen would just take their sermons out of books of sermons that were popular at the time. So it does seem like he takes his duties seriously. Now, having said this, is this the standard that Austen is setting for her clergyman characters? Well, no, she does want something more out of them. And I say this because after Pride and Prejudice, after that was published in 1813, she started working on Mansfield Park, her next novel. And she actually wrote to her sister Cassandra saying that she was writing on a new book, on a new story, and saying that for this new story, she was going to have a complete change of subject, and the subject of her new book was going to be ordination. So we know that Austen is actually thinking of Mansfield Park not primarily as a novel about a love story or a marriage, although that happens at the end, but as a novel about ordination. So she does take the duties of a clergyman very seriously. And in fact, throughout the whole novel, Edmund Bertram, the kind of hero of the story, is preparing for ordination. And there is the whole issue of whether it is actually going to happen at the end or not, because he's also in love with Mary Crawford, who doesn't see being a clergyman as high status enough, and she's sort of subtly, well, not so subtly actually, trying to dissuade him from actually choosing that as his profession. He doesn't relent in the end, which is good. And there is a very interesting discussion actually somewhere around the middle of the novel between Edmund Bertram, who is still preparing to be ordained, and the villain of the novel, Henry Crawford. Because Henry Crawford, he is a very good public speaker. He recites passages from Shakespeare's plays out loud for everyone at Mansfield Park. He impresses everyone with how well he reads. And he makes this remark about how he would have been an excellent clergyman because he's very good at public speaking, and being a clergyman is all about reading well and kind of entertaining the congregation, etc., etc. And Edmund Bertram is kind of shocked by this, and he reminds him, no, actually, it's not meant to be a performance. You're meant to genuinely care about your congregation, not just entertain them. So there is this tension between performance and genuine feeling that you find so often in Austen's novels. But in this case, specifically in the context of how important it is for someone going into the clergy, doing that for the right reasons. And it's interesting that Mansfield Park came right after Pride and Prejudice in terms of order of publication, because in Pride and Prejudice, of course, Mr. Wickham was famously offered a church living. So Mr. Darcy would have had what I believe is called the advowson. So he would have had the privilege of being able to name the next clergyman for the parish attached to the Pemberley estate, which is the kind of system of patronage that we also see with Mr. Collins and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. And Mr. Wickham could have had that, but he turns it down to, I believe, study law, which he also doesn't do in the end because he's Mr. Wickham and he's terrible. But the point being that he's offered that living, not because he's particularly religious or particularly devout, simply because of the system of patronage. And I think Austen is subtly, digging at that and kind of criticizing that through Mansfield Park.
Very interesting, okay. Well, let's hear from our audience now. We have microphones available, so if I choose you, just wait for the microphone to come to you first. Could we take a question from here, please? Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you so much for a fascinating lecture. I was glad that you mentioned Northanger Abbey, because I feel it often gets overlooked by Austen scholars. One of the most sort of common things to say about Northanger Abbey is that it is the perfect parody of the sensationalist Gothic novel, sort of as of Mrs. Radcliffe, and that whole genre. But do you think that, given the sort of all-knowing, almost polemical voice of the narrator, and the narrative of a young heroine who is tempted by the ways of the world, confused by supernatural powers, and then has to have a moment of self-reflection and ultimately marries a clergyman. Do you think that there's a meaningful case could be made that Austen was also in some way satirizing the polemical evangelical tracts promulgated by Hannah More and the such like, which have a very similar overarching narrative relating to their heroines?
That's a very good question. So you're drawing the link between Northanger Abbey itself being a parody of the Gothic, or satire of the Gothic, and you're asking if Austen would have been perhaps at the same time satirizing that kind of sentimentalism. Yes, I would say that's quite likely. I mean, she's very scathing of. I don't believe, unless I'm wrong. I'm trying to think if she directly mentions Hannah More in her novels. I think she does. I think she says in one of her letters, sorry, I meant in one of her letters, not her novels, I think she mentions that she tried to read, I never know how to pronounce it, but one of Hannah More's most famous novels, Coelebs. I think that's how it's pronounced. I always get that wrong. I think she mentions, probably to her sister, most of her letters are to her sister, that she tried to read it, and either she couldn't get through it or she didn't like it. So there is a passing mention of Hannah More. So most likely she did not particularly appreciate her as a writer. But what else was I going to say? But at the same time, I don't think, we should take that to mean that Austen is suspicious of any expression of strong feeling. It's just that she's always very concerned with the difference between performed feeling and genuine feeling. So, you know, one could say, for example, that she's somewhat, that through the character of Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey, she's satirizing very sentimental writers, very emotional writers, because Catherine herself is so kind of naive and overly emotional and sentimental and all of that. But at the same time, you see that Catherine might have been wrong that an actual murder was committed, but she was right that Colonel Tilney was a terrible person, more so than Henry Tilney would have admitted to himself. So at the same time, there's also beauty to that naivety of Catherine Morland, and in that specific case, her overly emotional character, sure, she needs to regulate her emotions, but because they're genuine, they're not criticized in the same way that they would be with someone like Henry Crawford, who kind of has all these displays of emotion but is a terrible person. I hope that answers your question. There's kind of two sides of it, but that's a really interesting parallel that you've drawn.
Let's see, who else? Could we have a question here from Ben? Over here.
Thanks so much. You mentioned, or you just observed this common pattern of the marriage, or the books resolving with a good marriage. Social order restored through a good marriage was the quote. And then you talked about these social incongruities will disappear when we're united with God. Do you view her, does she connect those two things? Marriage, supper of the Lamb, a wedding restores social order in the larger narrative of the world, in the Christian understanding. Does she connect that with the structure of her novels? And then is this a purgatorial reformation that's happening inside of her novels? Does she draw those parallels? I'm just interested.
So tell me if I'm wrong. So you're asking if she explicitly draws those parallels between a good marriage and the kind of salvation plan, or if I'm kind of more reading into it myself, or kind of drawing those conclusions versus her being more explicit about that. Is that fair? Okay. I would say, that's an excellent question. I would say she is never she's never explicit about that. What I would say is that it's very important to keep in mind what marriage as a sacrament would have meant to her at the time, which we have, to some extent lost in, post-Christian secular society now. And obviously there's a couple of places where we can look for that. Generally speaking, in Christianity, what is the purpose of marriage? It's for the two spouses to help each other get to heaven. So even at that level, the marriage plot of her novels revolves around the idea of two people not completing each other in the kind of silly soulmate, narrative that we often have these days, but it's more specifically two people that are going to actively help each other become more virtuous so that they go to heaven. So in that sense, you have the kind of microcosm of the greater plan of salvation in the microcosm of marriage, and then slightly more widely in the kind of small social circles that she's writing about, in these kind of tight-knit communities. If you have one family that has a good marriage, that benefits the whole community. And the other place where we can look for what marriage means to her, I would say, is the Book of Common Prayer, which I've mentioned a few times in the lecture. So in the Book of Common Prayer, in the kind of marriage service, the reasons that are given for the purpose of marriage is to have children, to avoid fornication, and companionship between the husband and wife. And that is exactly, what you see in the kind of good marriages she has in mind, especially the kind of the companionship aspect of it. So I think we have to look for it there. So it's not, maybe explicit, but she's doing on the small scale what, with a Christian framework will happen on a much wider level with the ultimate plan for salvation. You're putting me in mind of the fact that, there's that very famous quotation in one of her letters or something like that, where she said that she writes on like an inch of ivory or something like that. I don't know if anyone can correct me. I'm trying to think of the exact quotation, but the point is that she saw herself as someone working on the kind of minuscule details of what it's like to live in a small community and detailing the kind of relationships that people have on a very small scale. But that doesn't mean that it can't kind of have wider implications, if that makes sense, if that answers your question.
Let's have another question. Could we have a question from you?
Thank you. And while you were speaking, I was trying to reflect as to whether I could remember any nonconformist or Roman Catholic characters in her novels, and I couldn't immediately. But I did wonder, from your knowledge of her biography, what exposure she had to non-Anglicans in her lifetime and in their social circles. Perhaps none, I don't know. Yeah, okay, so let me go through the examples I can think of. So she would have, obviously, you know, evangelicals at the time, they would still have been within the Church of England, so in that sense they were not separate from Anglicans, but she would, but they were starting to have some slightly different practices, especially in terms of the liturgy, and Methodism would have also already started to become popular, and she was aware of Methodists. I think, is it in Mansfield Park? I forget that towards the end of Mansfield Park there is some kind of snide remark aimed at Methodists. So clearly, you know, she was aware of them, but maybe was suspicious of them. In terms of other kinds of nonconformists, I'm trying to think. Well, she speaks very highly in a letter of the abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, and I think he was to some extent slightly. I think he was an evangelical, so, you know, so there are some examples there of her being aware of people that would not have been very, you know, kind of traditional Anglicans in the same way. She also really didn't like her cousin, Edward Cooper, who was more kind of evangelical leaning. She thought he was just pompous, so some criticism. And then in terms of Catholics, I think all we really have to go by is that she wrote a short history of England where she says that she hates Elizabeth I and she likes Mary I. So she's kind of defending the Catholic rather than the Protestant there, which is always quite funny. So, you know, clearly, some take that to mean that she had some Catholic leanings. I think that's stretched, you know, taking it a bit too far. It's a bit of a stretch, but it does maybe suggest that she was not particularly prejudiced against Catholics, maybe. But yeah, that's probably...
Meet one, I imagine.
I would imagine so. All of with her, the kind of social circles that she moved in, I would be surprised if she met many Catholics. Probably not. Yeah, although her sister-in-law, her brother Henry married a woman that had been married to a Frenchman who was actually killed. He was guillotined. I can never say that word. Guillotined. So she had some exposure to at least, you know, someone coming from a Catholic country in that way. Yeah.
Very good. Could we have a question here, please?
What do you think is the role or the part played by Fordyce's sermons?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I mean, okay, so obviously Mr. Collins likes Fordyce's sermons very much, and he's always threatening to read them out loud, which is, you know, it's one of the kind of running jokes for any Austen fans of, oh no, Mr. Collins is going to start reading Fordyce's sermons again to the Bennet sisters. I don't personally, know the sermons very well. What I would say is that there are several instances that I can recall in Austen's letters where she's sort of critical of any, you know, kind of manuals to young women or whatever it may be, or, you know, works of instruction to young women that heavily focus on, for example, chastity. That's something that she's quite strongly enraged by. The reason being not because she didn't think chastity was important, but rather because at the time it was often portrayed as the only virtue that was important for women, whereas she's kind of saying, actually, there are many virtues that are important for women. So if you look, for example, at another novel, well, several other novels that were extremely popular in her time, there was a novelist called Samuel Richardson, whom Austen really liked, but many of his novels revolve around the main heroine remaining, you know, chaste, and and I think you can see that Austen is wrestling with that in her novels because, yes, like she does criticize women that commit adultery or run away, like Lydia and like Maria Crawford, but she also doesn't think that that's the only important thing. And I think anything to her that kind of smacks of that attitude to women, she's slightly critical of. Not to say that she didn't think that was important, but it just wasn't the only thing. And I wonder if some of the kind of satirizing of Fordyce's sermons comes from that. That would be my impression. But I would have to think longer about that. But thank you for that question.
We have one final question here.
Yes, this is not so much a question as a request.
Okay.
Might it be possible for people asking questions to stand up? One can see them better and hear them better.
Okay.
Do we have any other questions? We have a question here.
We do. Okay, good.
Could you just hold it to your mouth? If that's
While I was reading her books, I was wondering why the positive heroines are not doing any charitable work, which they could have done with children or with the poor in the parish or with the sick and so on.
Why they're not doing that kind of work? Sorry, did you say? Sorry, I can't hear you very well.
They don't do any charitable work. And
Yeah.
the only one that comes
Yeah.
to my mind is in Persuasion, where Anne is visiting a sick friend, sick and poor friend.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that is something that is brought up in Emma. So we are told in Emma that she goes around to visit, I forget the name of the family, but she's kind of doing the rounds of all the families that are in difficult financial situations in her local kind of parish. And I think she's described as bringing food and all kinds, and clothing and all kinds of things, particularly to one family that had several sick children. So we know that Emma does that, which would have been considered her duty as the daughter of the kind of most eminent family in the village. We don't often see it described in her other novels, that kind of charitable work taking place. I think it's one of those things where we have to assume that the most prominent families in her novels are doing that kind of work, and I say that because Jane Austen herself would have done that kind of work. She describes doing it in her letters. Her sister Cassandra would have done that kind of work. We know that was going on, especially daughters of clergymen were expected to do that kind of charitable work. So yes, it's mentioned a couple of times, not as prominent as, like you said, you might assume. I think that's partly because we're kind of assuming that that's going on in the background. But it is a good question. Maybe she should have mentioned it more often.
Any other questions? Very good. Well, we can draw things to a close now, if you'd like. I will just mention one final thing, which is that we have reprinted the prayers of Jane Austen. There's a pile of these in the corridor. If you'd like to take one as you leave, you're very welcome to. And as I say, please take a term card if you want to know all the other things that we are doing this term. And finally, just join me in thanking our speaker. Okay.